Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome back to Loughborough University's Institute for Advanced Studies virtual workshop on Great Power Competition in the Anthropocene Arctic. I'm delighted to see so many of you able to join us again, and possibly a few new faces there as well. Having spent most of yesterday's session discussing what the Anthropocene is, whether it is even a useful term for thinking about geopolitics, and what it might mean in the context of the Arctic, the focus of today's session really is on what the Anthropocene means for great power politics, great power competition in the Arctic, and potentially also beyond. Before we get into that though, I'm delighted to say that Loughborough University's Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research, Professor Steve Rothberg, has joined us this afternoon and would like to say a few words. So, Pro-Vice Chancellor, please.
Duncan, thank you very much. It's great to be here just to say a few words as your event begins. A very warm welcome to everybody on the call. I'm aware there's a very large number of people here from all across the world, and that's fantastic. This online format that we've all been grappling with for the last 9 months certainly has some advantages in terms of reach on events like this, so it's great that everybody could join us. I'm kind of tempted to play some kind of who's travelled the furthest kind of game, but I don't really know how that translates into the online format. So maybe you can have a think about that during a quiet moment later on too. And apologies also that I can't welcome you all one by one because, well, I'm pleased to say there's so many of you. But what I would like to do is say thank you to the external speakers that are here with us today, to Dr. Jeffrey Sloan from University of Reading and Dr. James Rogers from University of Southern Denmark. We appreciate your contributions to our event very much. I'd like to just say briefly a few words to emphasise how important the Institute of Advanced Studies programme is to us, and how important the topic of Arctic is to us at Loughborough. The Institute of Advanced Studies, IAS, as we know it affectionately, we launched only in May of 2017, and within 3 years we'd welcomed 194 visiting fellows from 34 countries, and the IAS had absolutely won a place in the intellectual hearts of the colleagues across our campuses. Over the last year, we've added a residential fellowship scheme to our IAS, and that's been a very significant step for us. And a global pandemic certainly hasn't thrown us off our stride in that respect. We've have our second residential fellow with us at the moment. In fact, I think she actually finishes today. But we've had our second fellow with us for the last few weeks, and we'll shortly welcome residential fellow number 3. And this event itself is another milestone for us in IAS as the inaugural event in our Spotlight series. So if you didn't realise you were participating in such a historic event for us, then now you know. Meanwhile, as I should say in my best narrator's voice, meanwhile, under Caroline and Duncan's leadership, our interest in the Arctic here at Loughborough has been growing at a real pace. A year ago, we hosted the Natural Environment Research Council's National Scientific Conference on Arctic Affairs, and this led to a very significant role that we've taken in writing the EU, NATO and UK Arctic strategies. So this really is shaping up as a big and important area of research for us here in Loughborough, led out of our politics and international relations unit. We hope that this week's sessions are going to be followed up by sessions in summer 2021, and we hope that they will be in person. In a historic week in which we've seen the first vaccines being given, I think we can dare to start thinking now about a return to normal service, and maybe the summer of 2021 is realistic. So in times to come, when people ask, where were you when the coronavirus vaccine programme started, you'll be able to say, I was at Loughborough University Institute of Advanced Studies talking all about the Arctic. And on that note, I'm going to hand you back to Duncan, confident that this is going to be an inspirational afternoon for you all on great power politics and the Anthropocene. So have a great afternoon. Duncan, back to you.
Thank you, Pro Vice Chancellor. We really appreciate your support for this event and for taking the time to join us today. So as I was saying, today's session is on the Anthropocene and what it means for great power competition in the Arctic and beyond. And just as we did yesterday, we have three fantastic speakers lined up to get the discussion going. And like yesterday, the format will be the same. Each speaker will have around 15 minutes each before we turn to the discussion, during which I hope our audience will be ready to ask questions and make comments of their own. I'm also keen that our speakers and indeed our chair from yesterday also take the opportunity to respond. I'll be monitoring the chat throughout the session, so if you do have a question or a comment, please let me know via the chat function. Now, as we listen to today's discussion, I'm keen that we don't forget what was discussed yesterday. And in particular, I'd like to remind you just of some of the key points that emerged, all of which I think demand that we really do take this idea of Anthropocene geopolitics seriously. The first of those points relates to sovereignty, because when we talk about great power competition, most of us are talking explicitly about competition between territorially bounded states, organized in a system based more or less on the principles of self-determination and non-intervention. This has, of course, been challenged post-1945 by the idea of the responsibility to protect, albeit to date, this is primarily focused on the protection of people. However, if, as Simon Dalby argued yesterday, we're now all participants in making the world, does that mean states increasingly have an obligation to also protect the environment, especially those key components of the Earth system, like the Arctic, but also others like the Amazon? Could great power competition in the Anthropocene see international intervention on environmental grounds? When we see the international community demanding that we save the Arctic or save the Amazon in ways that Arctic or Amazon states may not agree with, is this the beginning of Anthropocene international competition? The second point relates to power. Again, Simon Dalby yesterday said that made the great point with the term firepower, that this has been a central feature of international competition for centuries. Firepower here defined in the broadest sense as the ability to create energy and heat, whether for the purposes of production, development, or war. Great powers have been built on the mastery of firepower. But then Mia, with her deceptively simple statement about the difference between breaking and making ice, offered us the idea of ice power and the prospect that great power competition in the Anthropocene may be less about the ability to create energy and heat, and more about the ability to store energy and cool. Geoengineering is, of course, what immediately comes to mind here. But isn't it interesting that we still see geoengineering as a future technology related to cooling the planet, whilst ignoring the geoengineering that has already happened to warm it? And the third point relates to geography and the idea that both Simon and Klaus have written about, that our geographies and associated geopolitics are being scrambled by our growing sense of the Anthropocene. And in particular, as Ingrid pointed out, our sense of proximity is perhaps being redefined in relational rather than physical terms. This is something that I've written about as well, when trying to think about how the UK and countries like China think about being the Arctic's near neighbours. But perhaps in the Anthropocene, all of us are now neighbours of the Arctic, the Amazon, the Himalayas, and so on. So with those 3 points in mind about the meanings of sovereignty, power, and geography in the Anthropocene, I'm delighted to be able to turn to our first speaker, Dr. Geoffrey Sloan, Associate Professor in Politics and International Relations at the University of Reading, co-chair of the Mackinder Forum, and author of many books and articles on geostrategy, most recently, Geopolitics, Geography, and Strategic History, to give us his thoughts on how classical geopolitical theory might address the Anthropocene. Jeff, over to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Duncan, for those kind words. And let me say what a pleasure it is to be invited to give this talk. I'm going to try and divide my talk into 5 parts. So if I could ask you all, if you like, to imagine a sort of a jigsaw puzzle, it's got 5 parts to it. The first part, I'm going to talk a little bit about Mackinder's sort of background and the various influences. I'm also going to talk a little bit, then I'm going to talk about the Arctic in classical geopolitics, really kind of drawing from mainly Mackinder's work, Democratic Ideals and Reality, which he wrote in 1919. The third bit I'm going to talk about is a little bit about an update, I suppose, in terms of the resources that have now been established that exist in the Arctic. Fourthly, I'm going to talk about China and China's maritime power and the Arctic Ocean. And finally, I'm going to try and share some of the interest, the emerging interest that seems to be coming from the British Ministry of Defence, and in particular its Chief of Defence Staff seminars, which have been running from 2018 through to the present. And then I'm going to draw some conclusions. I suppose, but starting by way of talking about Mackinder, I suppose, many people, of course, I suspect in the audience will be familiar with Mackinder. Some may not have heard from him, so I apologise to those of you who may have heard all this before. But I think Mackinder was that rare beast in British public life. He was a real polymath, and his ideas, I would suggest, were a product of careers that were forged both within and beyond the academy. He set up the university, the School of Geography at Oxford in 1899. He also was responsible for setting up the University College of Reading, of course, which becomes the University of Reading in 1926. He was the second director of the London School of Economics. But it goes beyond these achievements, of course, which that he was responsible for a kind of a practical input as well. He established a course on behalf of the War Office for Army Logistics Officers at London School of Economics in 1909. This ran to 1932. And in fact, those Army officers represented the first full-time students that the London School of Economics had. He also contributed to public service and became briefly an explorer. He led the first European expedition to Mount Kenya in 1899, and then the then British Foreign Secretary, Lord Curzon, appointed him as British High Commissioner to South Russia in 1919. He served in the House of Commons as a Scottish Unionist MP in a constituency for Glasgow between 1910 and 1922. He also was a member of the Privy Council and also was a member of the Royal Commission on Food Prices. And I think he recognised himself that his career had not been one of linear progression. In the 1930s, he said, there is another kind of career which I will describe as erratic, and such a career has been mine, a long succession of adventures and recognition and resignations. I do not admit to have been a rolling stone, because I've generally known where I was going, but I certainly have gathered no moss. And I suppose Mackinder's experiences in higher education, military education, politics, public service, diplomacy, and policy formulation provided him, I think, with a series of vantage points from which to view and evaluate the interplay of politics, both domestically and international, with geographical realities. So that's my kind of introduction to Mackinder. Before I start talking really about the Arctic, I suppose, in Mackinder's writings, I've drawn most of the information I'm going to talk about from the 1919 book, his book, Democratic Ideals and Reality, although obviously it does get a mention in his 1904 paper. But there's a couple of sort of, I suppose, propositions, which I'm going to sort of throw out first of all, because we can debate after as to whether they have any sort of relevance or not. I think one of the first one is that Mackinder wrote that each century has its own geographical perspective. And the second kind of related sort of proposition to that, he said that the geographical perspective of the 20th century differs from all the previous centuries by more than mere extension, because if you like, our outline of geographical knowledge was complete. And the third thing which he makes a reference to, interestingly enough, again, he said, makes the statement that we have lately attained to the North Pole, is the way he put it, and we have found it is in the midst of a deep sea. So that's by way of introduction. And I want to go on to my second sort of jigsaw piece, if you like, and talk about the Arctic in classical geopolitics. Mackinder argues, I think, about the importance of what he calls the brigading of data. And this, if you like, helps, as he put it, enables us to reason conveniently about the realities which are presented for what he calls strategical thought. And he talks about there are sort of three elements to this. And I just wondered whether we could put up the first map, please, so to help people to kind of see what I'm actually talking about. The first one, the next map, please. If you look at that map, he talks about the three elements. There is the northern edge of Asia is inaccessible. It's beset with ice except for a narrow waterline which opens here and there briefly in the summer. But then he goes on to talk about, if you look at this map, a little bit more description. He talks about the three largest rivers in the world, the Lena, the Yenisei, and the River Ob. And they all flow and run northward through Siberia to this frozen coast. And he also claims that they are detached for practical purposes from the system of ocean and river navigation. He also makes another interesting point about how this is connected. And I think that's the great thing about his perspective. He talks about the Arctic, but he does connect it to other adjacent sort of regions, because south of Siberia, of course, there are rivers which drain into salt lakes, having no outlet to the ocean. He makes reference to the Volga and the Ural rivers flowing into the Caspian, and the Oxus River flowing into the Sea of Aral. And I suppose taken together, the regions of the Arctic and continental drainage, which he refers to, measure, as he puts it, nearly half of Asia and a quarter of Europe. And what is also intriguing, I think, when I was working this up, I suppose, is that he actually has got a fairly sort of Mackinder is very much aware, I think, is that the geography and its geopolitical and geostrategic importance is something that evolves, and he actually puts in a footnote in this description that with the, as he put it, the aid of modern icebreakers to open a direct route to the Ob and the Yenisei may perhaps result in the establishment of a seaborne summer traffic to Western Siberia. And he also, I think, then goes on, talks about another region which is adjacent to it. And I think that, again, he talks about Europe. And the key thing, I think, is that he's making is that these regions of Arctic and continental drainage measure, as I said before, half of Asia and a quarter of Europe, and form a great continuous patch, as he put it, in the center, the northern center of the continent. And that whole patch extending from Siberia to the coasts of Bulgaristan and Persia has been inaccessible to navigation from the ocean. So I think that was one of the big things, I think, and one of perhaps the things to discuss. So in many respects, the significance of what he was saying when put in a broader context is that these areas, of course, have not been historically accessible to Western maritime navies. But again, he does continually sort of update this, and he said he makes the claim that the opening up of this area by railways, and of course 1919 is saying this, and by aeroplane routes in the near future, constitutes what he describes as a revolution in the relations of men to the larger geographical realities of the world. And of course, this region, I suppose, that you can see in the map in front of you, of course, becomes very much what he called the kind of the heartland. And then he then goes on again, and he talks about north, center, and west of the heartland is a plain, and you can see that that's the kind of the shaded plain there, rising only a few hundred feet above sea level. And you can see that he talks about this great sort of lowland, or what he describes on the map as the great lowland. And in that great lowland on the globe are included, of course, Western Siberia, Turkestan, the Volga basin of Europe. And then you can see again, if it's marked on the map, you've got the Ural Mountains terminate some 300 miles north of the Caspian, leaving a gateway from Siberia into Europe. So that is the kind of great lowland. So we've got two elements now. We've got this inaccessible area of the Arctic, bounding that or masking that. You've got the great lowland with these drainage of these rivers flowing north into the Arctic and south into these great lakes, and this is what he calls the great lowland. And then, of course, the great lowland, we come up to this the shaded area. You can see there where it ends, I suppose, on the foot of what he calls a tableland, whose average elevation is about half a mile, rises up to a mile and a half. And you can see the areas that it actually covers. And he describes this collectively as the Iranian upland. So the heartland, in the sense of the region of Arctic and continental drainage, includes most of the lowland and most of the Iranian sort of upland. Now, in terms of strategic thought, I suppose, Mackinder argued that the Arctic is a key part of this larger geographical configuration that Mackinder called the heartland, which was highly influential in his thought. And in many respects, some writers would argue that the geographical perspective of the 20th century has been a sort of a neo-Mackinderite one, and of course raises the interesting question which will pose as to whether it has any relevance as we're in the early decades of the 21st century. He then, I suppose, calls on history as important, because he claims that no practical idea, no idea that moves men to action can be grasped statically. And the key piece of advice, I think, is that in terms of thinking about the Arctic and thinking about its strategic importance in the past and the future, he makes the following statement. He said, we must come to it with a momentum of thought, either from our own experience or from history. So could we go on to the second map, please? This is, again, perhaps a more simplified one, where you can see there where he tries to give this sort of the outline of this sort of heartland area. So having talked a little bit about Mackinder's ideas, it's important, of course, he was writing over 100 years ago to kind of, to sort of update this a little bit. And I'm quoting really from the US Geological Survey in 2008, because one of the factors, I think, prompting increasing international importance of the Arctic, of course, is the rich availability of energy resources, which are becoming increasingly accessible due to warming temperatures and advances in, of course, extraction technology. I won't quote all of this because I'm conscious of the time, but in 2008, I said the US Geological Survey estimated that the Arctic contained 90 billion barrels of oil, 1,669 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, and 44 billion barrels of natural gas liquids, with 84% of these occurring in offshore areas. So this is a kind of a sizable amount of natural resources. And of course, the following year in 2009, again, the same survey assessed, of course, for instance, the petroleum natural gas resources for the Barents Sea off the coasts of Norway and Russia, and estimated that it possessed 76 billion barrels of oil, equivalent, including approximately 11 billion barrels of crude oil, 308 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, and 2 billion barrels of natural gas liquids. So you can see that that sort of enormous deposits of natural resources was simply undiscovered whenever Mackinder was writing about this in 1904, and of course in 1919. The fourth thing I want to kind of talk a little bit about is China. Now, there are lots of countries interested, I think, in the Arctic, and I'm sure you've already sort of discussed this. And I've chosen China really because I think that what you're seeing, what you're emerging in international relations, I think, is the beginning of a process where we're going to see a Sino-centric world order emerging. And the point that I would make is that although not geographically contiguous to the Arctic Ocean, China's increasing economic influence and military power make the Arctic an area of interest to Beijing. And it's interesting that contemporary Chinese policymakers refer to China as a near-Arctic state. They describe the Arctic natural resources, which I've just given a brief outline of, as the common heritage of mankind. And of course, they joined the Arctic Council in 2013 as an observer state. There's also, of course, a number, as you get in any sort of policy-making process, of course, there are some Chinese Arctic analysts who urge China to take, if you like, a cooperative role. There are others who believe that Beijing should become more assertive, I suppose, in its Arctic posture. This latter group, of course, would argue that the Arctic is an alternative to the Malacca Strait, which they contend, of course, the US and its allies could use to choke off access to Persian Gulf oil. That the Arctic is at a crossroads between the European Union, Eurasia, and the United States, and of course, with the US having a ballistic missile defense capability in Fort Greely in Alaska. So you can see that there is that sort of perspective. There has been an argument that has been put forward, provided by the People's Liberation Army Naval War College. One of the members of the directing staff argues that the melting ice reduces the distance between regional great powers while increasing the Arctic's strategic importance. It's also interesting to note that in October 2015, the Vice Foreign Minister of the People's Republic of China again described China as a near-Arctic state. And China published its Arctic policy paper in January 2018, and again highlights this document, stressing, of course, that while states outside the Arctic region do not have territorial sovereignty, they have rights concerning scientific research, navigation, overflight, fishing, etc. And that this is something which is China is very much interested in, and of course is in the process. China and Russia established a Sino-Arctic Research Center in April 2019. So again, I'm conscious of the time, so I don't want to go any great length, but I want to kind of finish off my last piece of the jigsaw. Really is the British Ministry of Defence. I think there's been very significant development here that in 2018, the Chief of Defence Staff, General, he established a strategy forum, General Sir Nick Barker, and in 2018, there was a strategic forum posing the question, does the UK defence need an Arctic strategy? And I know that a number of people from Loughborough sort of attended that. But what I think is also interesting is that in 2019, they had another strategy forum posing the China challenge. But I think perhaps most interesting of all, in 2020, there were not one but two strategy forums which had the specific focus of climate change. And one of the things that they explored, of course, was the implications for climate change for UK defence and security policy. So there's my 5 sort of points complete. If I draw some sort of conclusions from all of this, well, I would argue that the classical geopolitical perspective that Mackinder gave with respect to the Arctic needs to be seen in the kind of wider context. So if I could leave you with that first map, I think that that was put up there. In terms of understanding the importance of the Arctic, it needs, as Mackinder did, to relate it to the areas surrounding what he called the Great Lowland, and of course the Iranian uplands of that sort of shaded area. He also was aware, of course, that that technology changes and the significance of this changes. One of the things that he didn't really address, because it wasn't happening in his work, the era that he was writing, of course, is something which we all have to address now, which is this issue of climate change. But I think some of his propositions, I think, that he put out about geopolitical analysis are still relevant today. So I'll finish at that point. Duncan.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you for that introduction. Excuse me. Thank you for that introduction to Mackinder and classic geopolitical thought, particularly in the relation there to the Arctic. I think one of the things you've usefully reminded us of there is that in many ways, despite climate change, despite the ideas about the Anthropocene and so on, geopolitical interest in the Arctic and elsewhere still focuses on many of the same challenges that it always did, that were always a feature of great power competition, whether that's trade routes, resources, ideas about strategic flanks, heartland theory, and so on. You also highlighted the importance of technology, which is great because that takes us perfectly to our next speaker, who is Dr. James Rogers. James is an associate professor of war studies from the University of Southern Denmark. He's been an advisor to governments, parliaments, and international organizations. And he is an expert not just on the history of war, but also on how technology in particular is changing the future character of competition and conflict. So, James, over to you for your 15 minutes.
Perfect. Thank you, Duncan. I'll just share my screen. There we go. Perfect. Well, let me start by thanking you, Duncan, Caroline, Laura, and the fantastic IAS team for putting on this workshop. And also to our speakers yesterday, who stimulated some amazing debate into how we should or shouldn't consider the Anthropocene, but also really got me thinking about these differences between three-dimensional geological strata and the difference between that and geopolitics. And there was a great question as well about how new remote technologies can help us to traverse these distant, remote and inhospitable places. And I suppose my talk today fits nicely in the middle here, whilst continuing Jeff's great talk on how technologies change as well, because we'll reach maybe a point in history that Mackinder would have foreseen, because I'm going to talk about how remote technologies, especially remote weapons technologies, alongside new military technologies and quite considerable military hardware and infrastructure builds, are being used in combination to help reinforce the sovereign territorial claims, but also to patrol remote territories in the Arctic. However, before we can go into this, oh, will it let me move? There we go. No good Arctic talk can start without trying to define why the Arctic is important. And I should say I'm specifically going to focus on Russia. So I'm going to talk about why the Arctic is important to Russia. Now, first of all, we often talk about the Arctic as one single region, yet of course there are many different Arctics. And whereas the Northwest Passage, for example, is likely to remain ice heavy for a generation, the Northern Sea Route is quickly opening for business, and this is important. The Northern Sea Route can cut time and distance from Asia to Europe by around 2 weeks or 10 days at its minimum. By August 2018, there had already been an 81% increase in traffic on the Northern Sea Route compared to 2017, and in 2019, there was a further 63% increase compared to that previous year. Now, the May decree of President Putin has stated that there is an ambitious plan to reach 80 million tons of goods by the year 2024, not that far away. And this is something that they're on track to do, because even in 2020, despite COVID and global restrictions, shipping has increased on the Northern Sea Route, albeit by a more modest 2.9%, I think. And we're around 30 million tons on the Northern Sea Route at this point. What's shipped on it? Well, there is liquid natural gas and oil, which is, of course, shipped in, out and around of the Arctic, but also goods from Asia to Europe. Take, for example, the Venture Maersk, which is a Danish container ship that took South Korean electrical goods and Russian frozen fish from Vladivostok all the way around the top to St. Petersburg in quite an iconic and statement-making voyage. There's also Indian fine coal exports to feed that burgeoning Indian high-quality steel industry, South Korean electronics, like I say, Russian fish, and Chinese exports of computer and mobile technologies. So the Northern Sea Route is a vital bloodline for an economically struggling Russia, which can charge tolls, it can charge icebreaker transit fees, and of course it can export its vital natural resources to the markets that need them and are willing to pay the high price. But as part of this opening Arctic, Russia is responding to its security interests there by investing in a range of military technologies. In fact, in the recently approved and evolved Russian Arctic strategy, I think national security in the Arctic was mentioned at least 31 times. So how is Russia looking to fulfill its national security aims and protect its interests in the Arctic? Well, one of the first steps of securing this region around the Northern Sea Route in terms of new technologies was Putin's pet project of establishing his Arctic drone squadrons in 2014. Now, the workhorse of this force is the Orlan 10s, which is stationed from Nenets in the west all the way around to Chukotka in the far east. The base in Chukotka is around 600 kilometers away from the US St. Lawrence Island. Now, these are unarmed surveillance drones, and they provide situational awareness around the Bering Sea. They can fly 140 kilometers from the ground control station when linked up to the ground control station. However, offline, there are reports that they can fly around 600 kilometers in a more automated fashion and then return back to base. So this brings them with a full radius of traversing that area across the Bering Sea and over to Alaska. Interesting thing here is that these drones are also a workhorse of the broader Russian drone fleet, and they were notorious for jammings and working in small multi-drone deployments or rudimentary swarms over Ukraine, where they would send defection messages or jamming capabilities down towards Ukrainian troops. They're also there for monitoring combat readiness of remote bases, really important. If you don't want to send humans up into these hospitable places or keep troops on the bases all year round, then you can make sure the drones are seeing the bases are watertight and everything is in an operational state. Another interesting point is that they actually can be useful in aiding communication. The All-in-10s have their own 4G transmitters on them, so they can help you link up and communicate across a wider area, which we know is difficult in the Arctic regions. That's just but one drone. We have the development of the frigate drone, which is a far more substantial system. It importantly has a vertical takeoff capacity, and when it flies from its normal fixed wing takeoff route, it can carry 1,700 kilogram payload. And this is in tests at the moment, flies up to 8,000 meters of altitude with a 10-hour flight time, and it's no small drone. It has a 19-meter wingspan. The key here is that it's vital for resupply, but also potentially ideal for hopping between Arctic drone bases and the icebreakers that go in between on the northern sea route. They're largely designed to replace a number of the military helicopters that have become vulnerable due to ice sticking to the rotor blades, and a lot of helicopters that have been lost up there. So again, replacing the human in this remote Anthropocene Arctic. Then we have the largest of the drones that Russia is producing. And I would say at this point that Russia's entire drone program is far more engineered and engaged to testing any system that it creates into operating in the Arctic. And so drones provide us with a really useful lens to try and understand what Russia's priorities are in terms of military technologies and national security. Now, that a Hotnik is a longer range combat UAV. It's 20 tons, it's armed, and it was recently tested in -12 with more Arctic conditioning tests on the way. Like I say, they are armed. They are medium altitude, long endurance drones. They are the biggest that you can get. And they are used for protecting the state border in hard to access and remote areas and in places of active illegal activity. And that is a quote from Russian authorities. So that's a snapshot of the drone systems that can be used up in the Arctic. And these link up very well with the current generation and next generation icebreakers and military naval craft in the region, some of which are military icebreakers. You have the project 22220, which was set to be commissioned by 2021, originally by 2017, but was set back due to obvious sanctions put on Russia after the Ukraine crisis. But their flagship ship, the Arctica, has now finished undergoing its sea trials, and it is now in full active service. It's 173 meters long. It is nuclear powered. It's able to break through 2.8 meters of thick ice, and there will be 6 of these in total by 2025. This is really important that this is now on the high seas, because it goes towards Putin's plans to try and make sure the Northern Sea Route is a viable sea route all year round. And to ensure that, despite the fact that it's getting warmer up there, you will have volatile weather patterns where you will have ice thick, ice heavy, but also light ice or no ice periods. So your icebreakers do need to still cut through considerable amounts of ice. This links into project 10510, which is the next generation icebreaker, which you can see a mock-up of in the middle of my slide. Now it's bigger, it's 205 meters long, and it's able to break through 4.3 meters of thick ice. And the plan here is for these to be out by 2027 to 2033. The important part about this is that, like a lot of the recently laid down Russian systems, these will have an organic air arm capability on them. And that means that you'll be able to have your vertical drone systems landing on and off them like a lily pad. And then at the bottom here, you have project 23550, which has already been laid down, and it's an ice class patrol ship. kind of like an Arctic corvette, a multi-purpose vessel designed as an all-in-one Navy ship, an icebreaker, tugboat, and a military vessel. It's smaller, measuring 361 feet, but it does carry a pretty stonking 8 caliber NK cruise missiles, and there'll be 2 of these by 2023. If these are ship-to-ship cruise missiles, they have a range of around 300 to 400 kilometers. If they are ship-to-land, then they potentially have anything up to 1,000 kilometers. The calibers range in their range. Accompanying all of this, and this is something that's been well publicized, so I'll go through this relatively quickly, is the new autonomous Arctic drone bases that are dotted across from the northern sea route on the individual islands such as Franz Josef Land and Coultney Island and places like that. And they link up, they provide that link up between those Arctic drone bases, the icebreakers and military vessels in the middle, and then you've got the bases on the islands in and across from the Arctic sea route. You've got the Arctic Clover, which was completed in 2015. It has a coastal missile system, dome radar station, and helipads, or drone pads, if you want to call them that from now on. The Arctic Trefoil, the biggest of the ones they have at the moment on Alexandra Land, and that was laid down in 2017. 200 plus troops can be stationed there for 18 months. Has the added clout of advanced anti-ship missile systems with a 200-kilometer range. And a new, this is one of the most important things, 2,500 meter runway. So drones like the big 20-ton Okhotnik or Russian Su-34 bomber, jet bombers, can now fly from this site if required, providing both an defensive and offensive air capability. And then you have the Tixi base starting in 2018 on the mainland east. And here it was stated by the Russian Northern Fleet commander that we plan to develop an anti-aircraft defense unit here in Tixi. It'll become part of the 45th Army. It has radio and anti-aircraft missile units, and it must create this protective dome to defend the airspace above the Russian Arctic. And this dome metaphor is used a lot when talking about defenses in the region. Added to this, there are additional 4 bases at various stages of construction or upgrades. 470 pieces of Arctic infrastructure have been built since 2012 alone. And according to the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, 59% of the country's modern nuclear and missile arsenal will be located in the region by 2020. In November 2020, there were hypersonic anti-ship missiles tested by the Northern Fleet off the Kola Peninsula, and they have a 1,000 kilometer range as well, kilometer range. So what can we conclude from this? Well, from tracking the development and deployment of emerging military technologies and bases, we can begin to understand the changing character of the security environment around the Northern Sea Route. I argue in my work that Russia has, in essence, created a virtual net over its Arctic operations. They include these various medium and short-range missile capabilities, regional surveillance systems, electronic warfare capabilities, radar and air power assets, all linked up with icebreakers, various high-tech armed and unarmed drone technologies, and these bases as well. Of course, all of these have their civil applications, and search and rescue is important in the region. And as the Russians themselves have stated, law enforcement as well as climate change monitoring is important there as well. But the defense aspect, and in some cases the offensive aspect, cannot be missed, because there are important implications of this for NATO, for the US and its NATO allies. Now, when I first started working on this back in 2012, this was something that would never have really been recognized in Arctic discussions, but there's been a change in Arctic focus under the Trump administration, and especially pioneered by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who stated in 2019 that we're entering a new age of strategic engagement in the Arctic, complete with new threats to the Arctic and its real estate, and to all our interests in that region. And so we are fortifying America's security and diplomatic presence in that area. And so the US has laid out its plans to do that. We've seen, of course, that there are plans for 2 new bases, investments in icebreakers, and so on and so forth, as well as a real diplomatic push to try and smooth over US relations with Greenland and Denmark, which had a little bit of a hiccup. And the US trying to court the Faroe Islands as well, which of course has its substantial fishing links to Russia. There's no definitive indication of what Biden's plans are going to look like, but from my conversations with some of the transition team and those who worked on his campaign, it looks like it's not going to have a full abandonment of this more hard security approach. Instead, it will be a mix of hard security and climate security issues that will form part of Biden's agenda. So none of this is going away. And we can see some of these reactions in how US and NATO allies have responded to this Russian remilitarization of the Northern Sea Route. The US Office of Naval Research, the ONR, is managing what is officially called the Arctic Mobile Observing System. And this is a system of sensor buoys across the region that will be mixed in with underwater drone systems that will be able to survey or to hear any potentially aggressive military incursions into NATO spheres of influence around the region. There has been reported incursions of Russian submarines, for example, through the UK, Greenland, Iceland gap. There's the new US Air Force strategy, which states explicitly that the Arctic is among the most important, significant regions of the world today. And there has been increasing global hawk flights from Alaska. And just a couple of months ago, a Russian MiG-31 allegedly intercepted a global hawk over Arctic waters off Alaska on August 11th. Global Hawk is, of course, the most advanced drone system in the world at the moment and the longest range system in the world, but unarmed. The Canadian Department of National Defence confirmed that drones will routinely be used for surveillance and reconnaissance of the Canadian maritime approaches and in the Arctic, and that'll be by 2025. And this will likely be the Mark 9B Reapers, which you can see in the picture there, where General Atomics have already started to put their promos out there with news articles and with quite fancy posters like this showing that the Mark 9B is for securing the Arctic. Canada's quite for a long time wanted Arctic drones, trying to buy a decrepit Global Hawk from the Germans just a few years ago. And then there's small states and Arctic drones as well. The Icelandic Coast Guard have adopted a Hermes 900, which is a very large medium altitude long endurance drones with 1,000-mile range. This is an Israeli supplied drone, but it is provided with funding from the European Maritime Safety Agency. And it is, of course, for search and rescue primarily. Although I've heard Icelandic discussions where security has been mentioned and monitoring of fishing as well. And could it also be useful for patrolling that UK, Greenland, Icelandic gap? So all in all, to finish, these are to be used in very much, I would say, a similar way to Russia, providing a dome of which we can help survey our vast Arctic areas. Russia developed the blueprint for this. It's been relatively successful, so it makes sense that NATO allies do the same when they seek to patrol these increasing geologically and geopolitically important Arctic spaces. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. That was really very, very interesting to start thinking about there, how countries almost responding to climate change in the Arctic and these ideas about the Anthropocene, firstly, by actually trying to restore the sense of security that they seem to have lost because of this kind of destabilizing environmental change, opening up of the Arctic, however you want to call it. So if we're thinking about how great power competition and the Anthropocene interact in the first instance, there is much here to be said that this kind of almost doubling down on traditional ideas of security is actually what's at the forefront of everyone's thinking, rather some of the more expansive or altered concepts of security that we were touching upon yesterday. So thank you for that, James. Last but not least, for our last talk, it is my great pleasure to introduce my colleague from Loughborough University, Professor Caroline Kennedy-Pipe. Caroline is Professor of International Security and International Relations and is a leading expert on warfare and the history of the Cold War, who again, like our other speakers, also has a great deal of experience advising governments, parliaments and international organisations. Caroline, over to you.
Thank you, Duncan. Laura, could I put the first slide up, please, if that's okay? Okay, so thank you, Duncan. What I'd like to do in my 10 to 15 minutes is really take us back to the Cold War. And in particular, what I want to talk about really is how we thought about the Arctic during the so-called Second Cold War in the 1980s, and draw some parallels with thinking today about the Arctic. I'm not doing history or geography as autobiography, but I'd really like to start by going back to the early 1980s and asking, what did we think about Russia? What did we think about the Arctic during the heady days of that Second Cold War? And in that period, I was studying with Ken Booth, who some of you may know of. And I reread some of my notes from class with Ken Booth from 1983, actually. And we were talking about Arctic security. And we were very concerned about the Arctic. And it's interesting for me hearing younger colleagues talk about the Arctic as a zone of peace, as an inherently peaceful place, because that certainly has never been my understanding of this region. And indeed, when I went back to my folders from the Second Cold War, we were describing the Arctic in a very interesting way as an area with a sparse population, harsh climate conditions, and potentially with rich resources, which is a strategically important area, we noted, as an air route and as a waterway. And in particular, we noted back in 1983 that the United States, Canada, the Scandinavian countries, and the Soviet Union, as it was then, are engaged in forms of competition over oil deposits, fisheries, and other resources. And we noted that both the Western Bloc, as we called it, and the Soviet Bloc were spending millions of dollars fortifying and arming the region, which provides, we noted, the shortest air routes between major cities in Europe, Asia, and the Americas. We had no mention of ice melt, no mention of climate change, and most notably, no mention of China, no mention of near Arctic states, and certainly no mention of globalization and all that that has come to entail for the region. But a few points I think still resonate, despite Duncan's comments and other colleagues here talk about a changing Arctic, of course, in climate terms. But let me make a few points. The Arctic Ocean is actually a part of the Atlantic Ocean, whose littoral includes the land masses of the Northern Hemisphere. But most of the Arctic, I think it's worth noting, is water. Rather quaintly, we termed it in the early 1980s the polar Mediterranean. And we noted it was important strategically as an air route and a waterway, as a superpower corridor over the ice bombing, while under the ice voyages really characterized the region. And I think that that's still, all of those points, I think, still resonate. The Arctic still offers the shortest Great Circle route between Russia and the US, and the shortest distance between Moscow and the West Coast and between Beijing, what we called Peking, and Washington, is a line running directly across the North Pole. My point would be that for many of us, the Arctic Ocean is not a distant region. It is a central connecting area between North America and Eurasian land masses. And that feature of geography, I think, has not changed. And we need only note that, of course, the Americans have always been interested in the Arctic. William Seward bought Alaska from Russia. What a mistake that was from Russia. And of course, wanted and still has recently offered to purchase Greenland. So the strategic importance of the Arctic, I think, has always been with us and remained with us. And I would also argue that if we think just very simply about World War II, and I don't remember World War II, but we need only think of the very important convoys from Iceland, Scotland to Murmansk and Archangel. And note, of course, and I think this still resonates, that if we look at military history from the Second World War, German U-boat operations operated extremely effectively out of Norwegian fields. you know, it was very, very important that surface raiders could move from the Baltic Sea into the Atlantic Ocean through the North Sea and, of course, the Greenland-Iceland gap. The Allies, let's note, when we think about, as James so accurately described, a Russia threat, the Allies had to occupy Iceland, the Faroes, and Greenland. The construction of Thule, the base 1951 to 1954, cost $300 million at that time. We're also aware of technology, and let me posit here, somewhat controversially, that really the Cold War was exceptionally dangerous. If we think of in 1957, when Sputnik is launched, of course, when the Soviet Union launches Sputnik, it causes a massive escalation in American spending and a scramble to invent and deploy ballistic missile early warning systems, which stretched, of course, from Thule through Clear, Alaska, and into Fylingdales, just up the road from me here in Yorkshire. So I think this idea that the Arctic has ever been wholly peaceable is something that we need to deconstruct. I also think we need to look very, very closely at what have been perennial pressures on allies such as Norway. You know, if you think of Norway in the Cold War, for example, it was the only European nation other than Turkey and Iran, which had borders, which shared a border with the Soviet Union. The threat from the Kola Peninsula remained ever present throughout the Cold War. And in 1981, to return to my theme, Norwegian aircraft were scrambled 117 times, precisely because of Soviet incursions into airspace. So I would say that when we're thinking about Murmansk, we're thinking about the Kola Peninsula. If I could put my third slide up, Laura, that would be great. We're obviously still thinking about my favorite picture, about the Russia threat. So the Arctic has always been strategically important. Now, I don't want to re-rehearse what James has said, and I want to come on to China. But I think there are at least 6 reasons why Russia, of course, remains, it is the most important Arctic player. One point which we haven't talked about is, of course, that the Arctic is linked absolutely to Putin's nationalistic agenda. And much has been made, of course, that Russia has significant for it population centres. I mean, if we think of Murmansk, 300,000 people, compare that to Nuuk with 17,000 people. So the Russian population in the Arctic is of some importance to the nationalistic agenda. Oil and gas, we've already discussed, is of course important to Russia, and the Northern Sea route, although probably a far proscript moment, is also of importance. But I think Russia is of course the only non-NATO coastal state, and it will protect its European Arctic. And we need here to have a debate. We've practiced it again and again in many of our forums. Is Russian remilitarization predominantly defensive, or is it offensively planned? What I would say, and if I can do this by pulling age, not rank, it's important to note, I think, that Russia's Arctic capabilities remain way below what they were during the Soviet period, in particular in terms of military equipment and infrastructure. And, you know, the disarray that Russia fell into in terms of its Arctic militarization in the 1990s, you know, it's coming from a very low point, and we can defense whether it's defensive or offensive. But I think what we also need to note is I'm less concerned by Russian remilitarization, as it were, in terms of threat. I mean, the Russians simply don't want a war. I'm more concerned really with something that Duncan raised right at the beginning, which sticks to my 5th point, which is Russia is very keen on asserting, maintaining and defending its sovereign rights, whether in the Arctic or anywhere else. And I think what's particularly interesting is that the Arctic is regarded both it protects the Kola Peninsula, it protects Russia, but it's also a gateway to the rest of the world. And in that sense, I think we also need to think very hard about the new Russian understanding or assertion of sovereign rights. I'm very grateful to Tim Riley, I hope he's in the room, for discussing this with me extensively. Duncan said at the beginning that we're still in a world of sovereign states, and we are. But sovereignty has very many different meanings, and we'll return to China. Russia, from Crimea on, and even before in Georgia, has been pushing a very clear and oppositional interpretation of sovereignty to the West. We need only think of the justifications for Crimea and sovereign Russian ethnic rights in that part of the globe. And we're seeing this increasingly in the narrative that Russia is spinning about indigenous peoples. Here I linked to some of the talks yesterday, but also places like Svalbard, where again and again this issue of sovereign rights as opposed to sovereignty it is becoming increasingly important. So I think that it's not theoretical, it's actually a very practical debate in the Arctic about the rights of indigenous peoples. Russia has been leading the way on talking about sovereign rights for indigenous peoples. And so I think we need to take account, not necessarily of hard military power, but also these softer levers of power. So Russia, of course, an important focus of all our studies, but I just would throw out for discussion, we've been here before. And if I can, you know, if we think of the crises of the early 1980s, we've yet to see anything quite that dangerous, I would argue, in terms of Russia. And I would point to the, without any complacency, Russia's need for cooperation under international law, law of the sea, on all sorts of outstanding issues involving Canada and Norway. And there is a mix, it seems to me, of assertive Russian expansionism, if we can call it that, but also a very protective view of its position as an Arctic power. Jeff talked about China. In 1983, nobody thought of near Arctic states. We didn't even have that discussion. However, we would have to throw into the mix China. But what I would like to perhaps take up with Jeff is, thus far and in the main, China has remained within the boundaries of existing treaties and principles. What I think is interesting about China, and here I'm going to draw a pathway which runs in parallel to what Russia is attempting to do in terms of sovereignty, and look at what China says about human rights, indigenous peoples, and workforces, because there has been a systematic attempt to undermine human rights norms in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative. And I suspect very strongly that this will also be the pattern of behaviour in the Arctic. Now, China's had a long history thinking about polar politics, but I think what's interesting at the moment is, of course, China's political and economic leverage in the Arctic, which I think, again, far more than any form of Chinese military activity, will prove to be extremely destabilizing. In particular, its economic penetration, as we know, whether it be buying up or sponsoring companies in Greenland. It might very well be more leverage operated in that fractious relationship between Greenland and Denmark. And of course, Chinese investments in certain areas such as communications, media, new technologies generally, which I think is something we need to think about much, much harder than hard military capabilities. Particularly, I'd say that those new technologies create opportunities for huge political influence. But also, I think, you know, in terms of sensitive data and technologies. So if I'm thinking about a China in the Arctic, I think it will need to be taken into account that these new technologies, which are non-military or at best might be dual use, are the things I think that should preoccupy us, plus the undermining by China of a rules-based, norms-based human rights regime, which we've all benefited from 1945 on. So I'll leave it there, Duncan, if that's okay.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Another really interesting talk there, and I think especially useful how you sort of, I guess, situated the kind of contemporary Arctic geopolitics and the preoccupations of that in the context of a longer historical trajectory. And important reminders there, I think, as well, when we are thinking in relation to, you know, competition in the Arctic and how serious the potential for conflict is in the region, just sort of having that useful reminder that you know, we have been there before and it's been far more serious before than it is now. That's not to say it won't become serious again in the future, but it is still a useful thing to bear in mind. I want to move straight into questions and discussion now. I've been keeping an eye on the chat. Please do post in there if you do have any questions or if you would like to add a comment. I think to begin with, there was a question posed by Paul Taylor, which I would like to sort of modify slightly, but hopefully also give the panelists a chance to answer Paul's specific question. And what Paul was asking was about the viability of the Northern Sea route and whether we're making too much of that. And it just, you know, just to kind of situate that in the context of what we're discussing as well, I wonder if more broadly than that, are we making too much of how the geopolitics of the Arctic will change just because the environment is changing? I mean, are we falling into a trap of deterministic thinking where we think that you know, just because there is the potential for shipping routes, then shipping routes will follow, you know, ignoring all the commercial, political, social realities and so on. When our panelists consider that question, if they could also answer Paul's specific question, which is whether they think that the commercial potential of Arctic sea routes have actually been exaggerated. Jeff, could you go first on that one, please? Or James, if you're ready.
Yeah, sure. I really enjoyed just reading through the discussion in the chat, which I think answered the question. So if people want to go and have a look through the chat discussion between all of us in here, then it actually provides a lot of detail on that. There was a point made in there about Maersk. Of course, I use that as an illustrative example of how the Northern Sea Route has been used already. And the point that Maersk have decided not to follow that as a viable option in the near future. I would be a little suspicious about Maersk's announcement about that. I know they were in some quite high-level talks with the Russians about the viability of that route. And I think there was some pain at the idea of Russia introducing its quite increased tolls on the route as well. So I wonder the extent to which that's quite political, especially, like as it was said in the chat, Chinese major shipping companies like COSCO are still seeing that as a viable area, along with a lot of Russian companies as well, of course, who need to ship things around regionally, locally out of the area, but also take these things down to India. And I do, perhaps against the norm of everybody else, see that perhaps not immediately, of course, but with the rapid rate of climate change, and the reports again released in The Guardian today about how much it's just accelerating, that this will become an economically viable route, one that provides Russia with not only a vital economic bloodline, but a strategically important trade bloodline that allows it to supply Europe, supply Asia, and not have to go through those points like Suez. It gives it a certain amount of autonomy in its shipping, and it is just incredibly vital strategically for Russia.
Thank you for that, James. We have another question here. I think we can probably combine these together. One from Selma, who is asking whether Russia's investment strategy in dual use capabilities is actually an efficient use of resources, or whether they're simply attempting to send a message to other Arctic stakeholders. And I wonder if we can just combine that with a second question here from David Schwartz, which is also sort of asking about, you know, the Russian motivations in all of this. Is this for Russia, is there kind of changed approach to the Arctic about vulnerability, or is it about accessibility? So is this an opportunity or a challenge in the first instance? James, do you want to go first on that, and then perhaps Caroline?
Yeah, sure. It's a really good question. I think the investment in new technologies around that area is in many ways defensive. I think it is about obtaining more situational awareness in that region. I think Caroline's fantastic talk was the tonic that we needed to map my more bellicose leanings towards what all of this indicates. But I do think that when you have these increasing amounts of remote eyes and ears in the area, whether they be NATO or whether they be Russian, then hopefully they can be a more peaceable and calming influence on the region. Because one of the things that sends these myths and insecurities flying off in all directions is that it's very difficult to know what is going on in this vast area of the Arctic. So hopefully having able to have more eyes open through these remote technologies where it's difficult for humans to tread, we'll be able to avoid misunderstandings and actually have a more peaceable and cooperative region.
Caroline, did you have anything?
Yeah, so Duncan, if I just jump in here, I think what's interesting in response to the second point is Russia's approach really in the Arctic is it's a mix of interest, but also a mix of interest and caution. And I think what China poses to Russia is really very much that mix. So Russia welcomes Chinese interest in developing port infrastructure along the Northern Sea route. That's quite clear. Yet Russia's also very intent on keeping the NSR under its control. And that will create tensions with China, as China sees the NSR as just one element of its Belt and Road Initiative, and will resent obstacles to its free use of the route. And the Northwestern Passage, as James said, is just not considered to be a viable replacement because of poor navigation conditions and a lack of infrastructure. So I think while Russia and China are formally allies, Russia remains extremely wary of China's military power on its southern border. And as an Arctic nation, it will jealously guard any intrusion into Arctic affairs of non-Arctic states. And that's what's going to make its chairmanship of the Council so interesting over the coming months and years. So I see Russia as absolutely defensive in terms of protection of its interests in the Arctic. But I think the trick that we've missed in terms of Western policy is allowing China this free hand and not operating more leverage in what is a very testy and fractious relationship between Moscow and Beijing. And that's, I think, for policymakers in the room, something that really is quite fascinating, that China has been allowed to run to expand its influence in this way. And that, I think, is a concern for Russia. Russia also, of course, jealously guards, the approaches in Kola Peninsula still, as it was in the Cold War, hugely important. But what I find interesting about Russia's strategy, of course, is that in many ways its pressure on allies, both in NATO and outside NATO, have actually really formed or created or inspired quite a robust Scandinavian response, in which, of course, the UK is heavily implicated. So I think we can always count on Russia never to quite get its strategy right vis-a-vis the Scandinavian powers.
That's very interesting. Thank you, James and Caroline. I have another question for both of you, this time from Rob Hubert, asking about whether you have anything to say on the impact of the evolving nuclear weapons and anti-ballistic missile policies of the US and Russia, and what that means for the Arctic.
Oh yeah, just to jump in there, I mean, I mentioned it in passing in my talk, but it perhaps deserves a slide or two all by itself, or a presentation all by itself, because we talk about the Northern Sea route, of course, being economically important for Russia, but in terms of its nuclear strategy and its ability to provide a credible second strike, and of course to provide therefore a credible deterrence capability, then Russia has historically kept its nuclear weapons up in the Arctic. And like I said, with Shoigu's quote, it is increasingly doing so, whether that is also with intercontinental ballistic missiles, nuclear missiles, or with longer range or medium range conventional missile systems as well. And that's another reason why you have this vast amount of investment in military infrastructure in the Arctic, because they do provide that dome of defensive protection. And a lot of it up there is defensive air systems, ground to air systems that will protect any incoming threat to Russian nuclear missile capabilities.
Caroline, anything to add? Or Jeff, please come in.
Yeah.
Sorry, Jeff, you go ahead.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I thought I'd sort of bring in really is trying to understand sort of Putin and his motives. And I think one of the most interesting comments that Putin made, which was on a television interview in 2005, when he said that the disintegration of the Soviet Union was one, or as he put it, one of the great geopolitical tragedies of the 20th century. And I think one of Putin's clear aims, I think, is that the Soviet Union, which was, as we all know, was the world's last great land empire, is never going to return in terms of its geographical extent. But I think Putin is motivated that he is certainly going to ensure, and I think he's done it in a number of ways, that Russia becomes again a power to be respected, and it's kind of kudos, I think, he wants his kudos to rise. And I think one of the areas, I think, that he has obviously invested resources in and people in is the Arctic. And I think he sees that as increasingly important. And if you look what was that initial period after the sort of the disintegration of the Soviet Empire and what's there now, I think there's been a remarkable change around. So I think that's certainly one of Putin's motivations. It's not the only area, of course, where Russia has been active, but I certainly think that comment that he made in 2005 certainly gave you a real sort of insight to how he viewed the Soviet Union, of course, which as a serving KGB officer, he'd been one of the vital pillars of its institutions.
Yeah, so if I can jump in, Putin is on record as describing the collapse of the Soviet Union as a tragedy, and it certainly was in terms of reach, demography, and end of empires are never easy, even if they are forced and illegitimate empires. So what I would caution against is seeing Russia's Arctic strategy as separate from its broader view of global politics. And again, to return, to the crisis of 1981 in Poland, for example, 81-82, Russian interference in Poland was mimicked, of course, by its activities in Afghanistan. What we thought at the time was a push to into the broader Middle East. And what I would say is I don't think we should see Putin's defensive ambitions, if we can call them that, in the Arctic as separate really from the renewed cooperation with Iran. There is a global agenda here for Russia. It is a return to great power politics. Look at the effective Russian policy in Syria. And I think we mustn't separate the Arctic off, as perhaps we're all guilty of doing, from broader ambitions. Duncan might want to say a few words about the conception we're working on at Loughborough of a broader north, of what we might call Arctic plus, precisely because we don't want to silo Russia Arctic policy away from these broader themes, as I said, of rewriting sovereignty in all sovereign conceptions in parts of the globe, and looking at Russia's pivot, much less dangerous, I would argue, than China at the moment, but still there nevertheless.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point, Caroline. And I think in essence, what that really is about, perhaps in connection to the kind of broader themes of this workshop, is that to the extent that we think of the Anthropocene Arctic as being somehow fundamentally different from what we've seen before, what we're seeing in the UK, NATO, Russia, North America, China, all over really, is how we integrate that space into our kind of broader, wider geopolitical, geographical imagination. And I think that's what's leading to new and interesting ways of connecting the Arctic to the rest of the world. Just mindful of the time, because I would like to ask our speakers from yesterday, each one of them, if they would like to just make a couple of marks in response to what they've heard during this session. But before they do, I'll just take two last questions together. One of those is from Jonathan Bentham, asking whether, from NATO's perspective, what is the current and future relevance of the GI-UK gap? Is it worth reinvesting in surveillance systems akin to those of the Cold War, or has the focus now shifted further northward? And I think, related to that, really interesting question, I guess, there is that if new spaces are emerging in the Anthropocene, do we need new ways of surveilling them in order to secure them? And the second question was left by Adam Rutherford from NATO, who unfortunately had to leave, but we'll deal with the question anyway and send him a clip of the recording. Given policy changes are needed to tackle Arctic amplification, scrambled geography, and the onset of new governance systems that will likely emerge in the Arctic, taking this complexity into account, how do states confront dynamism and interconnectedness of change? Is it enough to simply wait and see when everyone's talking about the Anthropocene arriving with some degree of velocity? So two easy questions there. Who would like to go first?
I'll go first. I certainly think we're well past any notion of wait and see. And when it comes to should we heavily invest in these more detection methods like in the Cold War, I think it's already happening. You see some of the movements of money in US investments in surveillance and communication systems and the revamping of its bases in Greenland, or the increased investment in Keflavik, abandoned in 2006, I think, but now having Poseidon P8s sent back there. Of course, there's the NATO rotational that's going through there. And I actually would welcome manned, unmanned teaming in that area. Like I said as well, you've got the Icelandic medium altitude, long endurance Hermes 900. And I think all of this does indicate just how important the UK, Greenland, Iceland gap is. Caroline is, I would argue, the expert on this, at just how important this is to Norway, as are you perhaps even more so, Duncan. And our article on forward defence outlines exactly why that is important. So yeah, I think we're already in the flows of securing that and making sure that you can't have any shutting off of that route, and to minimise what has been quite often an increasing Russian incursions into that broadened area.
Caroline, did you want to jump in on either of those questions?
So, as you say, Duncan, you pose the easy questions about governance structures. It is, I think, interesting that there is a competition in terms of Chinese conceptions of sovereignty and sovereign rights and human rights. The Russians are constantly talking about sovereign rights. And then there's, if you like, the Western norm and rule-based order. I suppose the interesting question is which of these competing trends will prove most attractive in the high north or in the Arctic, because certainly I would say that Chinese economic influence, as a disruptor, but also as an extremely attractive proposition in terms of whether it's a financial crisis of 2008, whether it's the influence of COVID-19 on far-flung communities and sparse populations. It's how we're going to balance the attractiveness of a Western norms-based system against powerful economic incentives. So that's where I think a lot of the competition in these spaces will develop. And absolutely, as colleagues were talking about yesterday, the human element is going to be hugely important there. So I would see this as very much a battle of ideas. I mean, very much as we talked about during the Cold War, it is about ideological competition. We just, I think, lost the habit of seeing China and Russia as ideological powers, which I think is a huge mistake.
Jeff, any final thoughts from you on this?
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly agree with Caroline and James about the importance of the Greenland, Iceland, Faroes UK gap, and I'm sure most people participating here recognise its sort of seminal importance during the Cold War. I would just add in something extra, a little bit extra, in that James was referring to the upgrade of sort of capabilities by the United States. One of the problems I think that the Royal Navy had is that the Royal Navy really is in the process during the sort of the Cold War, I suppose. It was essentially an ASW Navy, and it was very effective and had a real sort of focus in that particular geographical sort of location. And I think if you talk to, I'm talking recently to one of the previous sort of commanders-in-chief of the fleet, that he clearly sort of recognised that was still important, but things were kind of shifting, because I think one of the things that's happening with respect to the Royal Navy is that it's increasingly looking east. It's increasingly with its very large aircraft carriers sort of looking to devote a lot of resources to them. So I don't think it's declined. I don't think that area has declined in its importance. I just don't think, given the way in which the Royal Navy has declined in terms of its size, I would question whether it's still got the kind of capability to do the sort of things it was doing in the Greenland, Iceland, Faroes UCAP during the Cold War.
Thank you, Jeff. I'd like to turn now then to our speakers from yesterday, just to use the next 10 minutes or so, just to give you the opportunity to reflect on some of the things you've heard. Really get back to that kind of core discussion that we're trying to engender here between the kind of geography, political geography inspired thinking that we had yesterday and the more strategic discussion that we've had today. And so perhaps if I could start with you, Simon Dalby, in time-honoured tradition now, whether you would like to come back on anything that we've heard today.
Yeah, just a few points, and I should apologise for I missed a few bits of this morning's discussion because Zoom has been very uncooperative. Usually this system works very reliably, but I got dumped off a few times. So I did miss particularly the last little bit of Jeffrey's presentation and the first part of James's, so I may have missed a crucial point. If you will forgive me a slightly lighthearted a response, what did catch my attention a few minutes ago, Duncan, is your reiteration of Adam Rutherford's question, because it did seem to me that was the crucial question. But there's a lovely pun in there in terms of, do we just wait and see? Wait until the Arctic becomes a sea rather than ice, and that seemed to summarize the whole discussion beautifully. I don't necessarily know that you intended to pun, but it does work very nicely in terms of the long term thinking about this thing, because I think that if we wait until it is just a sea, then we will have actually given up on serious attempts to grapple with climate change. Because it does seem, as I said yesterday, that the Arctic is really the bellwether for this, for the larger climate discussion. If we end up with the Arctic in sea and not ice covered, then we will be dealing with all sorts of far more dramatic climate and environmental disruptions elsewhere in the world, in which the Arctic is going to be a minor player in terms of the politics of this, even if it's actually a major part of the environmental transformation. And I think that focusing in terms of climate change only on the Arctic, in terms of the military dimensions we've been talking about today, is to miss its larger significance in the process of global transformation. And thinking about massive heat waves in India, or thinking about rising sea levels, demolishing lots of coastal infrastructure, never mind what happens to Bangladesh or Vietnam, we're going to be missing the really important transformations that we're undergoing. And that seems to me to be the greater significance. How is it that we might facilitate cooperation amongst the great powers? The Arctic may provide some vehicles for doing that, but the larger cooperation has to be on tackling the Anthropocene transformations, which are accelerating. And for that point, if we are serious about climate change, we are serious about grappling with the implications of this, well, then actually most of the oil and the gas that is under the Arctic, that as Jeff was pointing out, Mackinder couldn't have commented on. Most of that stuff simply has to stay there, because it's going to be the more expensive oil and gas to get out. We already have collectively nowhere much cheaper reserves that are more than adequate to burn through over the next couple of decades, if there's any chance of holding the global average temperature increase to 2 degrees, never mind 1.5. And I think that's the crucial recalibration of our sort of global geographic thinking that we really have to get clearly into policymakers' heads. And the regional focus is interesting insofar as it is the warning sign about what is likely to happen elsewhere. But the teleconnections, to use yesterday's phrasing, are what need to be on people's minds much more explicitly than just the regional focus on whether that is a sea or ice or some combination thereof. Okay.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you. Mia Bennett?
Thank you for the excellent discussion. It's been really interesting to follow these 3 talks today, which I think covered quite a different range of issues, and some kind of ideas that I heard come up were involving history, technology, and ideology, so going in quite a different direction than yesterday, which was really thought-provoking. I also seem to feel that Anthropocene was not mentioned as much, which kind of led me to think we were talking yesterday about kind of the relevance of this concept to different audiences and its appropriateness. And I was wondering whether Anthropocene is maybe a more relevant framing for geographers and maybe for kind of social scientists, as opposed to discussions with more of an IR focus that I think might just use the terminology of climate change and changing environments more so. One point that I might want to pick up on was mentioned by James. I really found it fascinating to see all the kind of new remote technologies that are being used to surveil and monitor the Arctic. And I was struck by his comment that with more information and more monitoring, hopefully there will be this continuation of a peaceful Arctic and less misunderstanding, less miscommunications. But with that, I was also wondering, well, how can we be so certain that everyone will agree on what's being seen in these images? And I just thought recently of a kind of report by an Australian think tank based on satellite imagery of all of these, the roofs of various mosques in Xinjiang being completely, I suppose, not destroyed, but taken, kind of taken down in a way, and China disputed this imagery and these claims. So I think we'll have to, going forward, see how this imagery, as more and more of it's produced in a place like the Arctic, how it gets interpreted in different contexts by different actors, and how that imagery can in fact itself be instrumentalized, and what kind of debates there will be over the truth, so to speak. So I think, yeah, a really fascinating discussion, and has made me reflect a lot on even more than just kind of the environmental and geopolitical shifts, but the technological and ideological ones, as Caroline rightly pointed out as well. I think that will still be something to contend with in the region. So thanks for all these discussions.
Thank you, Mia. Ingrid Medby.
Yeah, thanks. I'd also like to echo that. Thank you for this excellent discussion. It's been really fascinating listening to the talks. And I'd also like to add that there's been a really interesting discussion going in the chat, which I'd also like to say thanks to all the participants for chipping in and contributing to that, because these are huge topics that I think we all kind of engaged with in slightly different ways, from slightly different angles, and bringing us all together, which is, of course, many thanks to the IAS at Loughborough and Duncan and Caroline, I think has been really, really interesting. So, you know, as Mia just said as well, I think I've reflected a little bit on, as I've been listening, how the Anthropocene hasn't come up as much, but I think what does tie together a lot of what we've been talking about is this interest in different time scales. And I think it's been really useful today to go kind of back and think a little bit about the kind of longer durée of geopolitics. So hearing about Mackinder and the Cold War as well, and kind of how that has also led to the kind of thinking that we have today. I think it's been very, very useful. And of course, I think this is also where one of our challenges come in, as we highlighted yesterday, in terms of thinking about states, thinking about sovereignty, that part of the challenge for states and other political actors today acting on climate change at the moment is the question of time. You have these relatively short electoral cycles. You know, how do you get through the more kind of radical political changes that are probably needed? And Simon has highlighted really, really well how we really need to rethink governance mechanisms currently, and how do we do that within the structures, or from within the structures that we currently have. And I don't have an answer to that, but I think it is a really big and important question, and I think we have gone some way kind of thinking about that together today. The other thing I would add, and this also has to do with temporality, which I guess is the kind of thing that ties us together, both the Anthropocene and kind of great power competition here, is that we've heard talk of kind of offensive or defensive politics in the Arctic, but I would say there's also an element of the performative or symbolic here that I think is significant. Mia mentioned kind of geographical imaginaries and narratives, and the importance of that kind of symbolism of showing readiness for a future that might come. You know, when we think of the Anthropocene, we are thinking, of course, also linear time backwards, but I think very often when we talk about the Arctic, we are thinking about the future. So I think that sort of the performance of politics is not to be underestimated in the Arctic, and can of course have real tangible effects. It can lead to things that we might not necessarily want. So yeah, that's kind of a collection of my thoughts, but thanks again for some really excellent talks.
Thank you, Ingrid. And finally, I'd like to ask Klaus Dodds for any last thoughts.
Thanks, Duncan, for the opportunity to say a couple of words, and thank you again to the participants and the speakers as well for a really great session. I just had just three quick observations. I think first of all, I really enjoyed the talks, partly because I think each of the speakers played with a slightly different conception of the Arctic as a particular kind of space. So I think, you know, Jeff reminded us that Mackinder had a particular fascination with the heartland. James talked about the dome, and I think Caroline talked about the polar Mediterranean. And I think it's just one of the things that does tie in quite nicely, I think, is the way in which we think about spaces both literally and metaphorically. And I think the Arctic has been absolutely replete with metaphorical and metaphorical allusions that I think also speak a little bit, I think, perhaps to disciplinary differences and the way in which we think of space either as two or let alone 3 dimensions or more, or indeed a volume. I think the second thing that really struck me, again, and it comes back to the language as well, is the different kinds of Arctics being invoked here. And I you know, in the sense of an endangered Arctic, an entangled Arctic, a rooted Arctic, an extractivist Arctic. I mean, it really, I think, brings to the fore quite how contested these regional spaces are becoming, and the inevitable tension, I think, between the sort of circumpolarity of Arctic states with something beyond, particularly as the current moniker of global Arctic is trying to convey. And I think that does reveal really powerful tensions in terms of how we think about the relationship, say, between the Arctic and the Anthropocene, or the Arctic and great power competition. I mean, you know, for so much of the Arctic Council is predicated on protecting a very, very strong sense of the Arctic as circumpolar rather than the Arctic as global. And then the final thing, just perhaps a question to the speakers, and they don't have to answer it, but it was just something that struck me. We talk a lot about the Arctic thawing, melting and warming, and I wondered by the end of all of this how some of our concepts like great power competition have been thawed, melted and warmed. So for example, one of the consequences of talking about great power competition is that it tends to melt away indigenous perspectives and values and knowledges. You know, that kind of gets lost. Caroline gave us a sort of reminiscence of the 1980s. Well, I wondered a little bit whether that was an example of thawing certain Cold War narratives or depictions, for example, of Russia, of the Soviets, as potential threat. And then warming in the sense of that actually this conversation about great power competition has been in large part warmed by statements, pronouncements, Mike Pompeo's speech last year being a really good example. So I wonder what all of this does to our concepts in short, whether they melt, warm or thaw. Anyway, thanks, Duncan.
Thank you, Klaus. Really appreciate that contribution at the end there. Before we draw this session to a close, I would just like to thank all of our speakers again for their marvelous contributions, and also Klaus for chairing yesterday. I would also just like to hand over now to Professor Marsha Meskimen, who is the Director of the Institute for Advanced Studies, just to say a few words.
Thank you, Duncan. Yeah, I mean, this has been fascinating, and I'm so glad that I was able to attend in full for a part of this. And I want to start by thanking the fellows, the speakers, and Duncan for this really, really wonderful inaugural IAS Spotlight Series event. Arctic Geopolitics, I am completely convinced Arctic Geopolitics is an absolutely ideal Spotlight Series theme. The series meaning to give people a space to gather, you know, truly international expertise to discuss research areas of genuine global significance. And in just listening today and hearkening to the conversations on the chat and in the responses now to this, the notion of the hemispheric significance, both imaginative and material of the Arctic, is absolutely clear and pivotal as an economic space, a trade route, but also a cultural route, a route for the movement of ideas, the movement of imagination, the movement of discourse, as something which is central to both war and peace. And I was really interested in the relationship between discussing it as a military zone and then some of the comments Caroline made, because my interest in the peripheral instruments that I've had in Arctic have all been around questions around sovereignty and around the kind of pivotal role of certain Arctic countries, nations that have Arctic or reside within the Arctic Circle, in terms of their space in the Global Peace Index, and indeed in really profoundly important role they're playing in changing and challenging gender gap stats. So the interest in the notion of war and peace is quite profound, actually, in the region, but also the question of the role the Arctic plays in international law, the issues of sovereignty, both competition between great nation states, but also questions that are of increasing kind of significance around indigenous sovereignty. And then obviously this really pivotal role to rethinking notions of the Anthropocene and questions of profound impact at a global level of climate change politics and climate change science. So this, for me, I'm moved by the concept of the Arctic Plus. It absolutely powerfully invokes a notion of a space that is really pivotal for us to be considering. And I am absolutely delighted that the IAS in some way could engender and host and facilitate this discussion. And I'm really hopeful that these will continue throughout the year and that this will become a really productive space for an international gathering of thinking on this. Thank you so much for inaugurating our series, and thank you so much for organizing it, Duncan, and what a great job.
Thank you, Marsha. That's very kind of you to say so. You know, we were delighted, obviously, to be able to support the IAS in this. I said yesterday that this workshop was part of a conversation that we started in the summer, and clearly, I think you'll all agree that conversation is not over yet. And it would be presumptuous of me, I think, to start trying to draw together any major conclusions. So I'm not going to try. What I will say, though, is that we do expect this conversation to continue into 2021, hopefully with another IAS workshop in the summer. And we would be absolutely delighted to welcome all of those in the audience to remain part of that conversation. So with that, thank you again to our speakers. Thank you, Klaus. Thank you, Marsha and the IAS for hosting us. And I wish everyone a good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you very much.